Good evening and welcome to Commoners Podcast. We actually have a pretty special episode for you here today. I'm on location in Edinburgh, Scotland.
How are you enjoying it?
I love it.
Yeah.
I'm sitting here with my can of Iron Brew, sipping it slowly to make it last. Actually, I'm also here with my sister-in-law. Julie, what would you say Iron Brew tastes like?
I don't think there's a description of how it tastes. Just delicious.
We also have my wife Beth here. So hello Beth, welcome to probably our biggest fan, I think, is my wife.
A very proud wife.
And you don't tend to like Iron Brew at all.
No, but I'm not Scottish, so I think you have to be either Scottish or an inner Scot to like it.
It's definitely been nice having you here.
Yeah.
John, so
well, I mean, Iron Brew is fantastic, and it's low on my list of things that I've enjoyed about this city.
Oh, good.
It's been a great visit so far.
Good.
Beth has been gracious enough to make us excellent food every day. We actually just finished up some fish pie, and it's my birthday today. It's my birthday today. It's also Beth and Ab's anniversary, but they went out of their way to make it special for me. And I got a cake, I got fish pie, I got a whole case of Iron Brew. It's been a good day.
It's an event.
Very much so.
It's an event. So last episode we focused on Tim Farron and Bernie Sanders and the issues that both of them seem to run into regarding particular Christianity, and it kind of set us off on a bit of a rant about postmodernism and where values came from, how they came about. And so really over the past week, as John's been visiting us, we've been walking around the city along with Julie. Poor Julie has had to put up with these conversations as well. We've just been chatting more about postmodernism and its effect on society and kind of where it's heading. So we are slightly uncomfortable, perhaps. Would you agree with postmodernism as it would reveal itself in society at the moment? Would you agree?
Yeah. I mean, I think we both landed on the fact that we're uncomfortable with it. But I think we're struggling with a solution.
Right.
So you mentioned last week about having to set up an absolute value system. But I'm not convinced. Well, we do need a solution to postmodernism, but I'm also at the same time not totally convinced that everybody acts as though they are postmodernists. I've mentioned this to you over the week, that my thinking of it is that people believe what they believe to be true. They wouldn't look at their individual value system and say that it is relative and it's not true. But they would accept postmodernism in so much as it helps sort of solidify the fact that they can think what they want, but what they do think they rather take to be absolute.
Right.
I gave you the instance of somebody I know who's against global warming, for instance. Right. So they will look at the facts of global warming or the scientific facts and say that the mainstream interpretation of that is the mainstream interpretation, but the facts are the facts, and we can actually have differing interpretations of them. So it's taking sort of a postmodern approach to science when it suits their agenda. But this particular person is very much against the whole idea of postmodernism. They think that it's eating away at our institutions and our society, which you and I would agree with. But they're more than willing to actually accept it when it's an argument that they're trying to make.
Sure.
So, how do you do away with that?
Right. So I guess the issue that we're running into, and I think as we defined it last week, was that postmodernism is an infinite number of interpretations of, I think we were speaking specifically of literature last time, but really in essence data points. So it's an infinite number of interpretations of data, but postmodernism goes that extra step further and says that every interpretation is valuable.
No. It doesn't necessarily say it's valuable. It says that you can't privilege any one of them.
So it's okay. So of equal value.
Yeah, they're of equal value.
So,
but ultimately, I think what we've decided, right, is that, or figured out, is that the equal value is no value. But how do you inject value back into that system? Is I guess what we're asking, without appealing to some sort of transcendent value.
Right. Without it.
Well, that's my question.
Right,
I think you're more than willing to sort of go that extra step and go to transcendent. Yeah. I think Beth is as well, yeah? I think you more or less agree with Adam that you need to point to some sort of transcendent value. Because he's talking about what Adam wants to do essentially is reintroduce value into the system. Because postmodernism has effectively done away with that value. And his solution is to reintroduce the concept of a transcendent being as a god.
Not entirely. I'm only... So I would find it quite difficult to take that extra step. I mean, I think my own conclusion is, and ironically thinking in a almost subjective mindset, but my conclusion would be that the transcendent value would have to come from, specifically the Christian God. But in terms of taking the next step out of postmodernism, I think that you need to anchor something. You need to anchor the system of values that we have on something outside of the system. And I think that could be a deity, that could be some type of universal norm. It could be some, Mother Earth or some type of like Mother Nature type figure or obviously, again, I would go that extra step further and say that it's actually the Christian deity. But
I think, and Beth, you said that you kind of agree with that.
Yeah, I would, largely. Yeah, and I believe also that if you do believe then that, so as Adam and I do, that we have a Christian faith, that you operate then as if that absolute that then informs your value system is separate, and kind of you then have to believe that the absolute is absolute, regardless of how that informs humans, if that makes sense. Because I think that humanists are also making the humans the absolute reality, if that makes sense. So I think everyone does have an absolute that they're ultimately basing it on. Like you were saying, postmodernism, each person has their absolute kind of in that still. But if you believe an absolute to be separate, that is a being apart from how it relates to the humans. If that makes sense.
No.
Yeah.
Because I guess my argument would be is that postmodernism really manifests itself as individual absolutes in the guise of interpretation. Okay. So you're claiming that this is your interpretation, but really you don't personally view it as an interpretation. You view it as your own personal absolute. Because very rarely do people actually go against what they actually believe. In fact, you can find out what people believe by looking closely at their actions and not at their words. So what people do and how they act is really going to show you what they really believe in, what they take to be absolute.
But then you've got a problem of, obviously we then live in a society, most of us live in pluralistic societies that have multiple sets of belief or multiple sets of value, and we need to figure out how to live with each other. And so part of my issue with kind of your thinking is that, you can easily point to the Christian, the Muslim, the Jew, any type of religious person and say, well, you're claiming some type of transcendent morality on the basis of a deity, the basis of a holy scripture, supposedly. But at the same time, I would say the exact same thing to anyone that holds any type of value structure. Like it comes from somewhere that is ill-defined, that's difficult to substantiate within the system. So even if it is a humanist perspective, for instance, then, your human becomes the absolute value. Whatever is good for the human is by definition good, but that assumes that the human is in any way valuable. That's a presupposition. You could even say the same about, Darwinian biology, that, whatever helps you pass on your genes is good. Well, that's assuming that, survival and life is in any way valuable.
So I would sort of push back on your interpretation of, ironically, your interpretation
right.
of Darwinian reality. Because Peterson, I don't know, Beth, how much you've listened to Jordan Peterson at all.
Not at all, actually.
I think you would really enjoy it.
Yeah.
He's quite the character. But he talks about Darwinian reality, and essentially that is what's been around longest is more real because it's more hardwired into our biology. Essentially, what I would say is that Darwinian biology, or the idea Darwinian biology doesn't necessarily, if we're applying it to human values, it doesn't necessarily say that life is good, but I guess the good of Darwinian biology, at least applied to humans, is human flourishing, I would say, as a species, not necessarily life, because well,
that's a loaded word. I mean,
no, not necessarily. So, as a species, I'm saying. So, Darwinian selection, it doesn't necessarily act. It acts on populations and species. It doesn't necessarily act. I mean, it calls individuals, but ultimately it moves the species or a population in a certain direction. So whatever is going to be good for the species as a whole. So I think that's sort of what the humanist comes to. It's more of the idea of the human than the human himself. So it's not that you could technically sort of say that is sort of outside of the system. It's not an individual person. It's not an individual state. It's literally the human species as a concept.
I would disagree that it's outside of the system, though, because the value is still kind of arbitrary. The fact that, for instance, one is our species. The fact that, for instance, you can't really define flourishing within a postmodern context because, particularly within evolution, like it's never really necessarily an advancement. Again, as we were saying earlier this week, it's not advancement, it's just adaptation to new environments. Yeah. So it's not even a going from worse to better, it's just a simple adaptation into the next thing. And the fact that we've become smarter and that's probably the primary value. The fact that we have become smarter over our evolution is happenstance. It's chance. It's just the types of environments that our species has adapted into as it's come along its evolutionary journey. So there's no value necessarily in it. And even the whole idea of life as valuable can be broken down within the postmodern context, because, what is left after humanity no longer exists? Well, it's meaningless anyway, because we are the only species that works within meaning. We're the only thing by which meaning is derived. So, for instance, Earth and...
if an asteroid hits tomorrow and humans are wiped out, the Earth is still going to go on without us, and it's not going to matter a lick.
But even deeper than that, like the whole concept of meaning is a human construct. Like the folks that argue for human genocide to save the planet, and that's probably a little bit hyperbolic. They for instance, believe in trying to lower our population.
The planet will be just fine without us.
But it's not even that it will be just fine. Like, it won't have any meaning. There won't be anything called planet or Earth or sky. We make those categories. We make those divisions. Like,
right. No, that's a good point. I think we're coming across like the difficulty of sort of trying to discuss humanities in a hard science framework. So postmodernism actually fits quite well in the humanities because they are open to such interpretation. But the hard sciences like biology, physics, geology tend to focus on objective truths through inductive reasoning, right? So, right. Whereas, in the humanities, you're sort of...
It's almost entirely based on the interpretation of...
Right. But I guess what science... And I've said this to you the other night, this week when we were talking about this, is that I'm very uncomfortable with the application of postmodernism, and specifically I would be very uncomfortable with the application of postmodernism to any sort of hard science. Right. Because it seems to me that it's hard to argue against the existence of a postmodernist sort of framework, because you can't make the argument against the fact that there are an infinite amount of interpretations, and there's no real obvious reason to believe one over the other, except when you introduce a sort of self-correcting system like science, in which you take data points, and you can have your individual interpretations of them, but they're cross-checked against other interpretations, and the most interpretations that line up tend to be the general consensus, right? And so we sort of approach something like a truth. You can never prove anything in science, but you approach it. Whereas you can't even necessarily try to prove anything in the humanities because it's accepted postmodernism. But we talked about this in the case of gender identity and pronouns and things like that, where you were legitimately concerned that there were sort of like a band of news Lysenkoists, I think we call them, where people were politicizing science and actually hiding outcomes of their experiments that might have gone against the political narrative.
I'm not necessarily saying that they're actively hiding. Well, the concern I have is that the interpretation of data results is coloured by what our society already thinks is right and wrong. Now, that has happened in the past. Like, you look at, it's particularly again within Christianity, but I'm using Christianity because it is the Western religion that science came about in and from. It was that a lot of findings within early science were then bent and mixed into the current religious thinking of the day, or were influenced by the religious thinking of the day. And I'm still concerned. I'm concerned that that's still happening. So I've got no idea, for instance, and obviously you hear differing stories. So you take gender, for instance. Is it binary or is it a spectrum? Our society today tells us that it's a spectrum. I'm not sure what the data looks like per se, but I would be concerned that in the same way that the data was probably interpreted through an older lens of binary gender, is today being interpreted through the interpretation of spectrum gender. And I don't know what the outcome is, but I don't want it to be coloured by anything that our society is currently saying is right and wrong. So in other words, I don't think... So if I'm reading you right, then what you're saying is that science, peer-reviewed science, self-correcting science, is essentially the answer to the postmodern problem. Is that right?
Well, no... I guess what I'm saying is that we need to, at all costs, protect science from postmodernism.
Right. So it's probably the closest thing that we're going to get to truth, but I'd say that it's not protected from at all. Because...
Well, if it works if it works as it should, if it works as intended, then it should.
Does anything work as if it's intended? Well, no, my point being a little bit more serious is that it's like, yes, you can say if it works as intended, but, realistically, it has always been coloured by the society. It will probably always be coloured by the society. Heck, it's even, it's coloured by the type of grants that certain research gets. Like, so even within science itself, without even considering moral judgments, like, there's already, failures in the system. Like, you look again at the problem that psychology has, in which 2/3 of their studies, according to one study that came out last year or 2015, that 2/3 of studies couldn't be replicated. That's a big issue. Now, granted, there are, certain issues within psychology that would probably yield that to be true, but science isn't being run correctly anyway, and without even considering the moral implications for it, simply because, after you find an interesting set of data, you publish without continuing to test that data. Now, of course, others go back to test it, and then suddenly you've got what happened in this paper, and that, a bunch of studies can't be replicated. So, if you were to claim that science is the answer, I would say, perhaps not. Yeah. Because of the particular influences that society has on everything, like science, philosophy, even interpretation of history. So.
It's a big problem. I mean, it obviously is, but I guess I'm talking more along the lines of hard sciences too, because we spoke about this where, the p-value, like the standards.
What is more? Sorry to jump in. But like that is just simple genetics. Isn't that hard science? Like, to figure out what the gender spectrum is, shouldn't that just be in the genetic code? Shouldn't we be able to figure that one out?
Not necessarily, because I mean, like, there's not overwhelming evidence just in the genetic code that homosexuality is a thing, right? But there are epigenetic processes that sort of seem to explain it, or at least point to, a reasonable explanation for it, right? So you might not be able to read it right out of the code. You need to discover something that's acting upon the genetic code, like an epigenetic process. So it's not as all simple, cut and dry as that. I mean, but it takes more research. But, I mean, would you consider psychology necessarily a completely hard science?
Oh, no.
Right.
So psychology is fairly weak. So, assuming that gender, for instance, is psychological.
Medical science in general is the standard for publishing, I guess, without getting into anything too complicated with the p-values, is that the standard for publishing medical research is very small because, or low because, people who are investing in research for treatments want that research out there without necessarily going through all of the hoops and ladders of getting it peer-reviewed before it's put out there. Right? So that's why we see new medical research all the time that says, oh, coffee's good for you. Oh, no, coffee's not so great for you. Oh, it's excellent for you. It actually cures cancer. Like that's why we see all these. It's almost like a trope now that you can't trust new emerging medical research because it's published at such a low value. But I mean, it's very hard to doubt anything new that's coming out of physics because they have incredibly stringent requirements to be able to publish anything, right? So I mean, this comes back to like talking about publishing. The problem is with like soft sciences like psychology and philosophy in particular is that there's almost no standards for anything to be published in postmodern journals. So, it's like I think, Beth, you said that you think it's more or less an accurate representation of, or at least explains the data points that we see best.
Yeah, I think it's the most accurate way of explaining kind of how society functions just now. Everyone has their interpretation of the world and everyone has the right to have their interpretation of the world, and so they have to be kind of treated equally by society.
Oh, okay, so that's interesting. You almost treat it like a rights issue then. Like almost the postmodern framework might be a right of people?
I think so. I think that's why we've moved towards it as a society, that it seems to be the way to kind of give people a most equal voice in the system, if you kind of, you think so?
I think I'd agree. Well, I think it's just the natural outcome of a pluralistic society, particularly for democracies. It's that, well, in a democracy, no one gets everything they get, so you need to, they want, so you need to balance out all the differing views.
Yeah, it's the natural extension of the idea of respecting your argument. So everyone has their own reality, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, like, maybe the natural outgrowth of a liberal society is the idea that you have the right to your own interpretation of reality.
Well, yeah, that's fine so long as you maintain liberal values. Now, granted, the values aspect of that makes me laugh because we are talking about postmodernism.
In addition to that, though, I would say as well that that's kind of how we've moved towards it as a society, but I don't think it necessarily explains everything, and we've talked about this earlier as well, but kind of having a Christian faith, I think it kind of explains how society can run, but it doesn't leave room for an absolute truth apart from that, if that makes sense.
Right.
So I think that's how society can view each other's opinions, but I don't think it has to be the reality at the same time.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
So then would you say that postmodernism should be the stance maybe of the state?
Yeah, I think it's a good
tool. In the view of the citizens, but maybe the citizens necessarily shouldn't believe it themselves.
Yeah, it's a good tool for approaching each other's opinions, but I don't think it has to be actual reality.
That's actually,
that's actually a really good point. That's nice. Beth, I think you should be on the podcast more often.
That was my one moment of glory. Let's see what else I can say.
I do like that thought, though. I like it a lot. Because, it fits very well almost into your perspectives of the two-box theory, where you have the state versus...
Yes, it does.
Your Christian box.
You're right.
So the secular nature of postmodernism would fall under that secular atheistic box.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And that's where the state should operate.
Yes.
But maybe people and individuals should not.
Yeah. The boxes are kind of more theistic and atheistic. And I think the state should always act out of the atheistic box because of postmodernism. That's high five. Well done.
Well, and if you think about it too, because we've talked also this week while we were traipsing all around the city about how, you don't have necessarily a loyalty to the state because you view it almost as a tool, yeah?
Yeah.
So,
right, yeah.
So postmodernism could be a tool of the state, right? But individuals should not maybe necessarily hold to postmodernism. But the state should have that view because it's supposed to represent the views of the people. So the state uses like a postmodern mindset as the tool to effectively represent everybody in society.
So how then does this look practically? So again, even if the state's still using postmodernism, then how does it value, for instance, things like democracy? How does it value? And actually, this might actually be getting back to your point, Beth, like the natural outcome of a liberal thought, like the outcome of everyone having their own individual views, is that within a liberal society, everyone agrees that they disagree. But they all agree on a particular structure, at least in which they can discuss and create policy that allows, people of, wildly different views to actually interact with each other, to have healthcare together, to have roads, to have, military schools, things like that. Actually quite decent. I really like that kind of train of thought. My skepticism though is still, I wonder if postmodernism isn't the best label for what should be used by the state, rather more, because postmodernism still can't value anything other than, the natural outcome of postmodernism is that the only thing that's left is power as well.
Yeah.
Which, makes sense within the state, but, power is, particularly if there's no value system controlling that power, then it is just power. It's authoritarianism, totalitarianism, like whoever has the sword wins. And that's my only concern. If you
like, then maybe it has to be a mix as well as what you were talking about last week, where you have some sort of scheme in the form of maybe that's the thing, you can't necessarily write a constitution that is not open to interpretation, can you?
Well, again, particularly in this era of postmodernism.
Yeah. I mean, because if you did have a scheme of inalienable rights, but then you also were to allow for the citizenry as a whole to sort of have their thoughts and have equal treatment under the law, even though maybe their views wouldn't necessarily be represented in government. So if somebody holds to illiberal values, it wouldn't be a persecution of that person. They could still go out and vote, but they'd have to know that, we're not going to maybe not tolerate somebody in office that holds views contrary to the scheme that's been written out. But then again, I don't know how you would necessarily do that. I mean, there are people nowadays who would argue that we talked about Ambien ban last week, or 2 weeks ago, who would say that, Muslims are, cannot run for office or be president because they go against the Constitution. So then you might run into those problems where, say, a radical imam who has, for whatever reason, gotten popular within a certain state that was running by this model, and a certain number of people voted for him to put him into office, would then the state say no because his views don't line up with liberal views or our values?
Right.
So yeah, we're valuing your opinion. You can have that opinion, but you're not represented. We touched on this a little bit a long time ago in the podcast.
Yeah. I was thinking that should you punch a Nazi?
Yeah, exactly.
That episode.
That's the episode. Because here's the thing: if a lot of Nazis are coming into your country, eventually won't they end up in government, or at least their views will end up being represented?
Right.
In a secular liberal democracy, it would.
Right. So ultimately, again, I think what I said in that episode was that we might actually need to consider things like the suppression of freedom of speech, which we're both very uncomfortable with.
Right.
But then that idea is breaking down, like the fact that you can't. So I think what I said at the end of the last episode was that, in terms of kind of values, where do you go in terms of values in postmodernism is either they have to be constructed by the state, and as we were saying, kind of put into a constitution, or you need to go back to kind of transcendent morality of, religion, essentially from, decades to centuries ago.
It's funny that it's hard to get out of your own framework of growing up, so like the values that we have are very much, if you're listening to us, they're very Western values. Like we're talking about freedom of speech, we really focus on like freedom, like rights and all these things that we would maybe think about think that a country should have as a set of values are still what we've been growing up with in our own kind of, our own like realities.
So really liberal values, what you're saying, are ultimately still subjective.
Yeah, it seems like I'm just putting that out there. It's just, it's hard to get out of our own frameworks. So it's just a side point.
I don't even know if that's a side point. That's a critical. That's actually quite a critical point because if we're worried about postmodernism eroding away liberal Western values, we are assuming a value outside of the system inherent to liberal values. But where does the value of liberal values come from?
Right.
Right. I mean, and here's the thing too. It's if you do point to a transcendent God, right? I'm struggling to think about which religion would be conducive to liberal values, right?
That's a very good point. Naturally, I would say that because the West became the first to value the individual and individual values, and because the West was so heavily influenced by Christianity, and naturally, I would argue that actually there is a historical precedent to say that Christianity has evolved our Western concept. So it was, the concepts within Christianity leveled the playing field, or should have leveled the playing field for men and women, for wealthy and poor. Like everyone is equal in the sight of God. That is a huge progression in the thought of humanity. Right? The fact that everybody has dignity because they're made in the image of God. Those things are the basis. That you could almost call it proto-liberalism. The fact that even if no one has rights per se, everyone at least has dignity. Now, I'm not too familiar with the ins and outs of other religions. Necessarily, you could easily, or I'm not sure whether you could make the same argument from Islam. I don't know it well enough. Same with Hinduism and Buddhism and others. But
so maybe the actual theology and teachings of the Bible itself are not inherently against liberal values, because you are talking about like the sort of foundation for the other ideas that have been built up in the Enlightenment sort of revolve around the individual dignity of humans, and so as we've accepted the individual dignity of humans, then of course, if we're going to value dignity, then it is also, we're going to give freedom of speech. We're going to give freedom of religion, freedom of protest, freedom of all.
They were the natural outcomes of people being individuals with worth.
Well, in a sense, I would accept that. Although I don't know whether or not that was always the case, because the Catholic Church is not a paragon of virtue in the past. And the thing is too is that if you read about Christian democracy and the encyclicals of popes and things like that, they have really over the last several hundred years developed this narrative of human dignity, and that's the biggest thing that they focus on. And Christian democracies sort of focus on that as well. But again, how much of that was also the influence of the Enlightenment and the Church sort of keeping up with society as well? Because in the Middle Ages there certainly wasn't a whole lot of dignity to go around. I guess was what I'm saying. So
No, agreed.
I'm saying that the church has evolved. So maybe that is sort of in the Bible itself, right? You can glean that from the Bible itself. But I think to your point that you've made several times is that the church suffers from a terrible cultural history.
Well, it's bad PR.
Right.
Well, not even bad PR, like just a...
poor management.
Yes. Yeah. In a sense, yeah. So, brief overview. Whenever the church goes into bed with the state, both suffer.
Yes.
And that has been consistent since 300 AD.
And I do like... so last time we spoke, I did say something along the lines of where I could see myself sort of coming back into the fold of some sort of conception of the church, right? To preserve absolute values in the face of postmodernism. But I guess, and your point was then that, the church suffers from poor PR. So if, right? And that's a big if, say Christianity or any other religion that suffers from this huge this history that discredits its message, let's put it that way. Mm-hmm. Even if going back to that in some sort of values framework that we could glean from an absolute, how do you convince people of that?
I'm not sure this is exactly answering that question, but I just had in my mind just then that actually I think if you I don't know if you can take an argument from the Bible that what we have now. So I do think that Adam is right that you look at the Bible and it says that humans have inherent dignity, and that is the basis for kind of a lot of the human rights that we have now. But I think you look at the Bible and one interpretation of it is that the best system would be communism, with a kind of God added in. Like, I know that Marx is very kind of...
socialism.
But you look at the early church and the apostles, it's all about community. It's not about individual rights. It's not about... So I'm not sure that... But then, there are Christians as well that can look at the Bible and find kind of a right-wing version of government. So I'm not sure that that Christianity informs government, informs a particular political practice. I think, again, we're talking about postmodernism and kind of a reality separate from that. I think, as a Christian, I would say that kind of it informs life and the reality of life, but I don't think you can look at it to say one certain thing about politics.
Right. To kind of go off of that, I wonder if you could make a C.S. Lewis style argument then and say, so you were asking John, how do you... What did you ask?
How do you convince people?
How do you convince people is that, C.S. Lewis argued that everyone had an innate sense of morality. And so I wonder if we're starting to head back in that direction. Now...
Yes.
And he used that as a proof for God. That was...
it was mere Christianity, which is essentially his, reason why you should believe that Christianity is true. One of them being that everyone has this innate sense of morality, which we've touched on in the past. So
I thought that we've spoken about it in the past, and you've said that you don't necessarily view that argument as particularly strong for the existence of God.
I don't think it's particularly strong because I think there are other reasons to explain it. But I think it is an interpretation of the data points.
Well, ultimately, that's the problem. Is that anything that at least anything that we've landed on so far to sort of maybe put a foundation to our society, and for lack of a better term, kill off all the postmodernists. Or starve them off at their source is what Jordan Peterson would say, right?
Yes.
By introducing some new set of value. When we even scratch the surface or dig into it, it turns out that there are just as many interpretations of that foundation.
Yeah.
Regardless of whether or not it lies out of the system or not.
Yes.
So... Yeah. And you've talked about Christianity being unique in that I don't know if it's necessarily unique in this way, but it fits well into a postmodern world because it offers revelation in a world that struggles with identifying the truth.
Right.
But then I don't know how that works, right?
Right.
I don't know why I should necessarily trust the Bible over any other sort of revealed text, right?
Mm-hmm.
Especially when they're contradictory. And then also, if you have, essentially what I'm trying to say is that this revelation, there are multiple revelations. So how do you interpret between which revelation is true?
I don't think you can necessarily, particular within a postmodern mindset, but also within a scientific type of mindset either. Like, because it's like, trying to measure a length of string. It's just, it will change. It is just different. So it's not. Christianity, I think, does fit really well into a postmodern mindset, particularly my specific theology, because I do tend to be of a more reformed kind of predestination, predeterminist type of mindset in which, God definitely comes in through history and drops bits of revelation. Like, the Bible is a conglomeration of people that have received revelation through time. So from whoever wrote the early passages of Genesis up through Revelation itself, we have a blooming book called Revelation. But you're right, it's not, there's certainly, well, I guess to just go into the theology a little bit more, from my perspective, faith is ultimately a gift. So faith is God-given. That means that not only is God dropping revelation into history, he's also reaching into history and tapping people on the shoulder and saying, hey, hello, I'm here. And that works within the postmodern mindset because nothing should make sense until that little tap on the shoulder happens, within my view of Christianity. Which means that no one except those who have been tapped on the shoulder will understand it. And that's an annoying, and Beth, you might actually disagree with me in this because we tend to have different theologies.
Yeah, I'm not sure about predestination because I find it hard to understand how God could choose some and not others. I really struggle with that. Mm-hmm. So we do differ on that point. To go back to John's point then about why are you convinced by Christianity, I would actually agree with you though, Adam. It has been through a personal experience. But then ultimately, it's why faith is called faith. It's not something that can be rationalized, I think. And I know it's so frustrating that you kind of wish that, like, you could prove that, okay, this version of the events is more, it seems more trustworthy than another religion, or I don't know, but you can't necessarily prove that. But yeah.
Yeah, there's an odd paradox almost in which the claim of Christianity as absolute is on the basis of subjective experience. Because I've used that same thing with John as well, actually, is to say, well, actually, Christianity is one part rational logic and another part experience.
Well, we've learned down this exact same thing. Personally, I don't think we would discuss this in the podcast, but I've talked in the past about how I have not had an experience of God ever. Really, never. Even though I was raised in it my whole life. I went to church, prayed, read the Bible diligently when I was little. And you and I are very similar, Adam. And I think we've talked about before how the difference between you and I is the experience.
Yeah,
because if you had not had the experience, you probably would believe as I do.
Right.
But that just seems so damn subjective.
Right, and that's the ironic paradox in this entire conversation talking about postmodernism and eventually religion. Postmodernism is that maybe you just need to maybe it's just something that has to be accepted, that everyone's view is subjective, and then the only thing that ultimately solves it is good policy in the state that regulates the difference of opinion so that we can actually live together. perhaps not going as far necessarily as, shutting down freedom of speech, and perhaps not even going as far as, and perhaps not going as far as to say that there are certain ideas that can't have a voice in the state.
Well, it might not have to go that far, because, think about Germany. You literally can't be a neo-Nazi. It's like illegal.
Right.
Is it a framework like that? I'm not even 100% comfortable with that, but I don't know how otherwise you sort of fix the problem, because it seems like what we're landing on here is that something that I've thought is that just because something makes you uncomfortable doesn't mean it's not true. So we talked about how there very, very well may be no objective moral standard, right? That's a very uncomfortable thought, because that means that the difference between what Hitler did and what, I do on a daily basis is just a subjective opinion. But it's not quite necessarily as cut and dry as that, because you can also say, well, yes, it's a subjective opinion, but it's a subjective opinion in the same way as chocolate tastes better than tar is a subjective opinion. More people are going to hold the subjective opinion that chocolate tastes better. There's going to be a few nutcrack cases who think that tar is better.
Well, again, the weakness in that is assuming that over time tar suddenly becomes, far more tasty.
Yeah, right. No, right. But I guess not necessarily universality, but commonality, maybe, or just because a lot of people think something doesn't mean it's objective. Yeah, you would agree with that,
yeah,
right?
True.
That's true, but it also doesn't mean that it's not. If that makes sense.
No. I would agree. I would agree with that, but I guess what I'm trying to say is that it could be the case that postmodernism is true.
Mm-hmm.
In which case, there is no value.
Right, but I would look at it and say, in the same way that, it's objectively true that cancer exists, right? I don't like it. I don't like that it exists. It's deadly. It kills people, and it's a horrendous disease. Postmodernism could be something that is true, but it also is deadly and eats away at our institutions and the very basis of Western society that we've sort of built up to this point. But just because I don't like it doesn't make it not true.
Yeah.
Right? Just because we're super uncomfortable with it doesn't make it untrue. So maybe we just have to sort of lie to ourselves and live as if it's not true. Which I would argue most people do.
Yeah, I'd agree with you. On that basis, anyway. Well, that's depressing.
But no. I don't. Well,
Well, in a sense, yeah, you could be absolutely right, but then.
But then
in that case, I like to harp on about it, the reverse pale blue dot.
Yeah.
Like the fact that. So Carl Sagan's pale blue dot being that, we live in a speck of dust in the middle of nowhere, therefore we should just all get on with each other. Mm-hmm. There's nothing to say that the opposite can be true, in which we should actually just take advantage of each other and push for ourselves, and our own power. And certain individuals have been able to do that, a la, Stalin, Hitler, plenty of authoritarian leaders throughout history. What that perspective means, though, then, is that we cannot criticize it. And you're right. Perhaps it just has to be down to the point of, well, we can't criticize it because it...
you can criticize it. It's just I don't have to value your criticism.
But then criticism itself is worthless.
No, well, to me it's worthless, right? But to you it might not be.
But it can't have... So to criticize an authoritarian ruler in particular, then, is needless, unwarranted, meaningless, lacking in any foundational arguments that actually supports the criticism of authoritarianism.
Right, but I guess what that would come back to for me is then the whole tar versus chocolate thing, right? Your argument about the pale blue dot is 100% correct. But I would venture to guess that most people would agree with Sagan over your interpretation. And that doesn't make it objective, but that just makes, just kind of
makes life livable.
Makes life livable. And ultimately, I know you're a fan of nihilism if the whole atheist box thing is true, but ultimately I guess it would have to be the only way that you could reasonably exist and be sane is to be an absurdist.
Yes.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Because if what I'm positing is true, and that postmodernism is just a fact that we just might not like, but we have to get used to, the only reason or the only way that you could really exist in that world where there is no objective meaning is to be accepting of the fact that there is no objective meaning, but still being happy, still finding joy in looking for that meaning.
Sure.
Which is the whole reason I started this damn podcast in the first place.
Well, I wonder if folks listening could actually come to agree with you.
How so? What do you mean?
Because my only thought being is that, if again we're talking about data points and interpretations, then, the interpretation that you posit yourself is just one possible interpretation of a reality, meaning that, it could either very well be a dystopian, valueless reality that we live in, or there is some type of transcendent morality, or there is actually a flying spaghetti monster that rules everything.
I like that. I like that.
Prefer that one.
Well, I guess I would. I'm foolishly applying the standards of hard science to soft science, where I would say, okay, yes, you're right. Okay, so a lot of people could come to agree with me that absurdism is a wonderful little philosophy, right? If we don't necessarily put any inherent value on anything, right? But we do value, or individuals, if a bunch of individuals have the same interpretation, then that sort of points to something, right? That could have value, right? Like if we would in a hard science. Then perhaps if most people, and this is where liberal values come from, right? A lot of people value them, and so we assume that they have value, right? So if a lot of people value something, just like coal versus tar, not chocolate versus tar, not coal versus tar. If a lot of people value something, then maybe that points to it having some sort of value, right? At least subjectively. But again, I just am not convinced of the fact that there's anything objective about value.
Which is fair enough, but and perhaps I fall into the category of people that can't accept that everything is absolutely and utterly meaningless.
Well, no, accepting it, I think, isn't a bad thing. We accept things that we hate all the time.
No. I'm not talking about the acceptance of it. I'm saying that I
guess it would ultimately come down to how you live, right? Because if you accept it and you accept absurdism or postmodernism or even nihilism as true, right? How does that then influence how you live? I think that's what it comes down to.
I still can't go over the fact that it would just be entirely and utterly meaningless. That's I don't know if it's a fault in our evolutionary biology that we just cannot accept that, or if there is actually something.
It's not something that's well. And the thing is, like, can you accept it but act as if it's not true?
Yes.
And then,
yes.
Maybe that's what you have to do. That's what I do. I mean, certainly, I don't know if I fully accepted that.
Okay.
Right? But I certainly act as if it's not true. Like with my girls, and that this is why I guess I would maybe accept that it is true, but teach them value anyway. Because even if it isn't valuable, I value it.
So essentially, your way of navigating out of postmodernism is to live the absurdist life.
Yeah.
And just be happy rolling the stone up the hill consistently.
I can go get Albert Camus tattoo and smoke cigarettes and be all cool and just enjoy my life.
Well, if ever there's a way to survive postmodernism, I think that's a fairly decent way to survive postmodernism.
Yes, surviving postmodernism. I mean, it's uncomfortable. It is very. I mean, but like, life is uncomfortable. Plenty of things about life are uncomfortable. It's just even through this whole conversation, anything that we've landed on that we've tried to put as a foundation that breaks the postmodernist worldview and says no, we can hang value on this. Ultimately breaks down when you dig into it too much, right? Because it even the foundation, the objective foundation that you're trying to put on it has an infinite amount of subjective interpretations about it. So the objective reality that you pin your morality on might be very different than the objective that I put it on. And how do you get everybody to agree on which objective thing that's outside of the system to hang it on? I just don't think you could do that. I think what you've just said, John, just kind of brings us back to the beginning of where we started. It's just that, okay, we're back to square one in terms of you didn't actually, you've peeled back all the layers of subjectivity to people's ideas again, and we're back where we started.
The myth of Sisyphus is an absurdist go-to myth. It's a Greek god, is that right? Who's punished.
Didn't he steal fire?
I think he stole fire, gave it to humans, and his punishment for doing this was to push a boulder up a hill, let it roll down. Every day. Push a boulder up the hill, let it roll down. And we might just have crash landed at the bottom of the hill again, so we'll need to tackle this boulder again. But it's fun to do. I mean, it's definitely fun to sit here and talk. And Beth, it was great to have your perspective because, that was an excellent point that you made, that each individual's opinion in a liberal system might actually require a blind neutrality of the state to value systems of its individual components. But that's something we could dig into. But it is getting quite late. And we do have to get up early tomorrow for our Scottish breakfast before we travel back to the States. We still have a little bit of sightseeing and Scottish culture to show our guests before we send them on our way. I think 2 more cans of Iron Brew to chug before I leave. So. Yeah. Drag on. I will. Beth, it was great to have you on. We'll have to do this again sometime. Yes, definitely. It was fun. Yeah, it was fun. And getting to do this in person is so much easier. Oh, far, far easier. The logistics are just terrible on the whole across the Atlantic thing. Yes. Really bad. But we are the transatlantic podcast. We are. There is just not today. That's right. So there is some authenticity via the difficulties that we go through. Yeah. All right. Thank you for listening. You remember that you can follow us on Twitter at CommonersPod. You can also see all of our previous episodes on YouTube. You can just search for us Commoners Podcast there. You can also send us any queries, questions, concerns to commonerspodcast@gmail.com. So, thank you for listening, and as always, stay informed.